Okay, yeah, that is recording. Hi everyone, and welcome to today's lunchtime lecture. I'm really pleased to welcome Sebastian and Martin from Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, which is one of the original ODI Startup Incubator alumni. And today the talk will be looking at the role of data, or lack of, and how it relates to building safety. It's just a bit of housekeeping. Hopefully you saw on the slide at the beginning, this meeting is being recorded. So please keep your cameras and microphones off through the duration of the talk. If you have any questions that come to you during the presentation, please put them in the chat. And then once the presentation has finished, we will invite you to turn your camera on and microphone and ask the question directly. And yeah, I think that is everything from me on the housekeeping. So I will pass over to Sebastian.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Thanks everybody for coming to this. I'd want to start off also by thanking the Open Data Institute for being an unfailing ally of the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, and for all its support given over many years. We're really proud to be associated with the ODI. I hope we've paid due recognition of that in all our parliamentary meetings and from our MPs who've acknowledged the support of the ODI in the various debates in Parliament. I'm just going to give an introduction to this talk. Martin, who is the Chair of Trustees at the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, is going to do the main presentation. And I just want to explain why he's qualified to do so. First, he's a leaseholder caught up in the cladding scandal. Second, he's the chair of Charter Key, which is an enfranchised site at Kingston Bridge in Surrey, which means that the flat owners own the building and the land there, which is unusual. And that's collectively worth about £250 million. So it's a responsible position that he has, and he's having to make all the decisions on many aspects, or together with his board, is having to make decisions on aspects of this issue. And the third thing I'd like to point out is that Martin and I have been raising the cladding issue with government since the autumn of 2017, within 6 months of the tragedy at Grenfell in June. It's thanks to Martin, and solely to Martin, that the enormity of the cladding crisis was being raised with MPs in Parliament from 2017 onwards. Over the past 18 months, it's become a mainstream issue, with hundreds of thousands of leaseholders now impacted, facing impossible bills and raising issues with the media. And that sort of, without wishing excessively to blow our own trumpet, we've been constantly ahead of the curve of officials on this, in spite of the fact that we're a minnow organisation, a minnow charity with a number of volunteers associated with us. And the government now has 200 officials working on the building safety crisis, and we're still awaiting a viable solution. I'll also just say a few words by introduction of the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership and how we came to be involved in all this. We're a registered charity in the Secretariat of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Leasehold and Commonhold Reform, which has about 185 members. Our patrons are the MPs Sir Peter Bottomley, Justin Madders and Sir Ed Davey, representing the three main parties in England and Wales. They are also the co-chairs of the All-Party Parliamentary Group, although because he's the Lib Dem party leader, Ed is replaced by the Lib Dem St Albans MP, Daisy Cooper, who is very active on the building safety cladding issue. The simple narrative is that we've been campaigning to reform leasehold tenure, which only exists in England and Wales, and which we regard as exploitative and out-of-date landlordism with roots in the Middle Ages. In modern terms, this means that flat owners don't own their flats, the land or the buildings, and only a long tenancy of time. As such, they are dealt with by tenants by the courts. This matters in the building safety cladding crisis, as it is extremely difficult for leaseholders to take legal action against developers who have built a flawed block of flats. The leaseholders have to persuade the freehold owner or landlord to take action instead. And as the freeholders are basically anonymous investors in a building's income stream and are often based in jurisdictions such as the British Virgin Islands, why on earth would they do something as unremunerative as that, as litigating on behalf of the tenants in a building? In short, leasehold makes flat ownership more complicated and unfair than it should be. In 2017, we were up to our eyes exposing the doubling ground rent scandal, at last getting leasehold into the mainstream media and onto the parliamentary agenda. Then in June, the Grenfell tragedy occurred. In the following months, it dawned on us, although not officials, that this was a disaster that would impact all modern blocks of flats. We questioned whether leasehold would survive the scrutiny that would ensue. Since then, we have seen government wobble on dealing with this massive issue, now costed at £15 billion. It is providing public money worth £5 billion. There are some quibbles about that, but I won't distract on that, to remove the cladding on high rises. But there is still the unanswered question of where the rest of the money will come from and how much is really needed. Forced loans on leaseholders, the innocent consumers in all this, were being considered and possibly are still being considered. But there has been an impasse in imposing them as government has cold feet. Meanwhile, thousands of leaseholders have been handed wipeout bills of £70,000 to £80,000, in one case more than £150,000 to repair these buildings. And some of these leaseholders are really not affluent, shared owners. So they'll only own 25% of their flats, but they face 100% of the bill to make the building safe. Government has been remarkably slow to gather the importance to understand the importance of all this. But just over a month ago, it did make a step which I think was very encouraging. We think that it was very encouraging. Basically, the community secretary was sacked and replaced with Michael Gove, and there seems to be some new thinking. He's making sympathetic noises. He doesn't think leaseholders should be paying anything for other people's errors. But how is he going to square the circle? We await an announcement which will hopefully take thousands of minor risk, low risk buildings out of scope of all this, and which will raise money from developers and the cladding manufacturers, as this crisis, which has fallen on so many innocent consumers, is a sector-wide failing. But key to getting this right and for strengthening our arguments in this is the data. And so I'll now pass on to Martin and his presentation.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that, Seb. Right, well, you can avoid looking at me. I'll put the screen share on now. So, okay, let's see. Here we go. There's right. Find the right screen. Okay. Okay. Today we're talking about the role of data in the building safety crisis. I was at a meeting with National Fire Chiefs Council the other day, and someone said the data can be very misleading because sometimes we're only looking at small numbers, but that fundamentally misses the point, because sometimes one is a very big number if you're talking about a building burning down, and sometimes one is a very irrelevant number. So it's about how people use the data, and it's been rather obvious that there is some exceptionally good data out there that people haven't really used, and there are huge areas where there's a lack of data. So I'm going to try and run through some of the bits of data that we either have or haven't got at the moment, and how they're impacting on why it's taken so long to address the building safety crisis, and where we might end up going with that data. So cladding crisis, as we've got it, or the building safety crisis, began with the Grenfell tragedy in June 2017. But facade fires on large blocks flats had gone back for decades before that. There was a tragedy in 2009 at a building called Lakanal House in Southwark, which resulted in a number of people dying and others being injured. There's a gentleman called Sir Ken Knight, who has been a very important person within the fire safety regime for many, many years, produced a report for the government. The fire happened on the 3rd of July 2019, and he produced his report by the end of that month. And in there, he had the statement that he didn't consider it was economically viable to make it a requirement to retrospectively fit sprinklers. Now that comment has perhaps gone on to haunt the sector for over a decade. It has in there the caveat in the second sentence where he says, however, it's a matter for individual housing owners and landlords to decide if automatic fire suppression is required as part of their fire safety management. This sort of sets out one of the major problems that we have in this part of the housing sector. Individual housing owners, by which I presume he meant the people who owned the flats, do not have the authority to install their own sprinkler systems, because that's likely to be something that takes place outside the element of the property that's demised to them. And of course, landlords only fit things and do things if they're charging someone else for the work. So anyway, we had Sken Knight producing this report out of the Lakanal House fire in 2009. Rather oddly, in 2012, the Building Research Establishment did a very, very detailed look at data from around the world on the benefit of sprinkler systems. Huge report. Now, rather oddly, Sir Ken Knight also happened to be involved with the BRE, and he was a director. So the figures that jumped off the page at me when I read the report was that installation of sprinklers end up reducing the likelihood of a fatality in various types of property by 90% plus. Injuries, 60% plus. So it's always been considered around the world as a very, very viable system. And yet we've not been fitting them in this country. Despite the data screaming at us, it saves lives. The one that surprised me was damage. I had no idea. I assumed if you had sprinkler systems, it was going to be pouring water all over the place, and you would therefore have the same level of damage as if the fire brigades turn up and put out the fire. But that's not what this report said. It said you would be reducing the costs of damage caused to property in fires by, again, nearly 90%. And being lucky enough to live in a house, I'm a bit surprised that it also tells me that sprinklers would be viable for my own home. But there we go. So we're sitting there with all of this data saying we should be fitting sprinklers, and yet nothing happened. With BRE, if you analyze their data, what it suggests is there's about a 1 in 80,000 chance of a death in a house fire and a 1 in 40,000 chance of a death in a flat fire. So therefore, the suggestion is when fires occur in flats, there is intrinsically a greater level of danger, but we're still looking at relatively low levels of risk. Okay, so back to our friend Sir Ken again. And in 2016, the BRE produces a report which says, if you read the second sentence onwards, with the exception of 1 or 2 unfortunate but rare cases, there is currently no evidence from these investigations to suggest that the current recommendations to limit vertical fire spread up the exterior of high-rise buildings is failing in their purpose. So here we are in April, the year before Grenfell is about to burn down, with the government's Building Research Establishment advising it sees the risks of external fire spread as very small. It's asserting its testing regime is working. it's not clear from reading that report what level of data that they've got that supports that claim. But nonetheless, we went in to 2017 with the government firmly of the view there was absolutely no problem with external facades and no risk from cladding. Okay, here's another bit of data which is a little odd. This is data collated by the Home Office just prior to Grenfell. Okay, so it's showing fire-related fatalities in England in the year 2016-17. And it's part of a report that looked back, a longitudinal report the government had looking at fire safety data over a number of years. Now you'll see in there, it puts the percentage of fires with a fatality at 0.7% in a house, 0.6% in low-rise flats, 0.8% in flats of 4 to 9 stories, and back to 0.4% in flats on 10 stories above. So if you interpret that data logically, it says the taller the building, the lower the chances are of a fatality in a fire. Now, those statistics are clearly massively slanted as a result of the Grenfell tragedy. But it's very important to if you could try and remember that data about the low-rise flats, 4 to 9 stories, compared to the high-rise. So what this data says is you are twice as likely to have a fatality in a medium-rise block of flats than you are in a fire in a high-rise block. Okay, so we get to June 2017. 72 people died in a cladding fire after they were advised by the fire authorities to stay put. Now, there were some very cruel comments made by Rees-Mogg, where he suggested that if people had used their common sense, they would have got out. But with all due respect to Mr. Rees-Mogg, if you have a fireman telling you to stay put, then that's what you're logically going to do. The fire authorities would have been using the stairways. They would have not wanted people there. As I found out, we had a fire at our site recently, and like the vast majority of fires, it was contained within a flat. The fire authorities arrived. They were very keen to ensure that everyone didn't stay in their flat, and they didn't try and evacuate. And it was quite difficult to explain to some people after Grenfell why you should stay in your flat. But the whole purpose of the designs that we have is that fire should be contained. Fire should not be spreading from flat to flat. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. At Grenfell, the fire tragically spread up the outside of the building, and so many people died. So we're now going to jump forward to 2021, because since the tragedy, the government has been desperately reaching out for sources of data. It discovered that it didn't actually know how many buildings we had, and you know, we've talked at the ODI before about the complete lack of reliable data on leasehold properties. So nowadays, the government have gone to all sorts of sources, including the Ordnance Survey, to try and get some robust figures to know what it's doing, why it's doing, and how it's doing it. To be honest, they are still in an utter mess because that data is still not reliable. So we have here the current figures they're using, they have an estimate of 12,500 buildings above 18 meters, residential buildings. If you look at the table on the right-hand side, that then they exclude 500 of those buildings as being slightly different from the rest that they're looking at. They've created a very, very, very round figure of 6,000 buildings in the social sector above 18 meters that they need to be concerned about, and exactly 6,000 buildings in the private sector. The chances of that being an accurate number is, of course, absolutely zero, but that's what we're working from. When we get to buildings under 18 meters, we're at an even more round estimate. We're talking about 78,000 buildings. The sources for that data are quite mixed. Nobody's really sure how reliable it is. As they pointed out, they're using some ordnance survey data and topographic identifiers, which is not exactly the most reliable source to use. So there we are, we're planning the what to do with building safety crisis without even being quite sure how many buildings we've got. So if we look at the monthly data that the government now publishes, it says that 94% of all identified high-rise residential buildings in England are completed or have started remediation. So this is buildings that have aluminium composite material cladding, i.e. the same that was on Grenfell. And that number has gone up in terms of remediation by 1 building in September. So we're not remediating at a very fast pace still. So you delve into those dumb numbers and suddenly your 94% disappears when we get to the private sector. And we still have a very large number of buildings where we haven't actually removed the cladding. We've got 30 buildings there where remediation started, the cladding is still on. 12 where there's a plan in place, but they haven't even started removing the cladding. And 10 where they've got a plan to remove the cladding. So here we are, 4.5 years on, more than 4.5, from Grenfell. We still have 52 buildings where we still have ACM cladding on in the private sector. It is not a fast pace of remediation. The other thing that happened right from the outset was government said building owners should do the right thing. From day one, they accepted that it wasn't the leaseholders' fault that we had a cladding problem. It was either the developer or the cladding manufacturers or someone's fault. What their data now shows, and this does look as if it's quite reliable, is that out of the 220 buildings in the private sector that have ACM cladding, only 50% of them have seen the building owner do the right thing. Now, it says there in their files that they have 89 buildings where the developer or the freeholder has committed to remediate their building. But we assume that in the vast majority of cases, that is going to be the developer. There's no reason for a freeholder to want to, or even necessarily be able to fix the building. What is very scary is the number of 21 buildings there. It says that's the number where the warranty claim has been accepted. So out of the 220 buildings, less than 10% have been able to make a warranty claim. which rather suggests that the warranty system that we have in this country is not fit for purpose. But as of the moment, nobody's even beginning to ask that question. The next figure on that page, 106, is the proportion of buildings that the government has accepted it will help pay to fix. Now, none of us have ever felt that it should be the government paying to fix these buildings. Government regulations may have been at fault, but the government did not build these buildings. But nonetheless, we've got 106 buildings in there that the taxpayer is being required to support. And that seems very wrong. There can't be that many buildings where it's not possible to find a developer who should have fixed the problem. The other issue that we've then got, and this wording from this government advice, it's slightly sort of reverse logic, but the two graphs there, the bottom one shows those buildings that are not in the private fund, i.e. are not being funded by the government, and the one at the top shows those that are being funded by the government. And what you can see from that is that the buildings that are subject to government funding are being remediated at a much slower pace than those where the developer did decide to do the right thing. And I think there's a very legitimate criticism of the fact that the government is taking too long to process the funding to get these buildings remediated. And remember, this is only the tiny subset of buildings that have ACM cladding on. We have a whole much larger group of buildings that don't have ACM cladding, but other forms of cladding, which will continue to cause problems. So one of the features that we've had as a result of their building safety crisis is that when the fire authorities have reached the conclusion that they feel these buildings aren't safe, they require the building owner to come up with an interim measure. And the option that you have is you either come up with interim measures as a building owner, which allow people to stay in the building, or they're decanted, in which case people are made homeless. So the most common interim measure that has been used is something called waiting watch. And this is where you have a group of people walking around your building day in, day out. It costs a fortune, and there are huge questions about its effectiveness. The cladding leaseholders have been asking from the outset, what's the technical justification? Where's the data to support waiting watch? It is a very old policy that comes out of the commercial sector when your fire alarm had failed at something like a hotel. You would temporarily put some people in for a matter of a week or two while you fixed the alarm. But nonetheless, the waiting watch system has been in place. Some sites have had waiting watch for over 3 years. It's cost a fortune for the leaseholders. The government is helping fund some sites now, but not many. So this slide is about the fire that occurred in Docklands earlier this year. And it was quite a nasty fire. There is currently an ongoing investigation by London Fire Brigade into what went wrong there. It was a site that had waiting watch, and the leaseholders surveyed their residents immediately after the fire to understand what was the basis that they used to get out of the building, what told them that they needed to get out of that building fairly quickly. And as you can see from the list on the right-hand side, there is one category that's missing, and that is waiting watch. So these people are paying for a waiting watch. It's been on site. It has not worked. Just one person out of the 224 people that were asked said that waiting watch played any role in them evacuating the building. By far and away, the biggest and most influential contact point was via their WhatsApp group. So this data was made available to us in May. We told the all-party group of MPs about this data some months ago. I finally got asked 2 days ago by London Fire Brigade if we could provide them with this information. It was data that's sitting there. It's very simple data. It says, here's a system that's not working, apparently. And nobody's been looking. Maybe they will do soon. Okay, so we now go back to our friend, Sir Ken, who is still around and playing a very important role. He is no longer a director at the BRE. He is, however, a significant advisor to the government. Most recently, he's been involved in creating the government's building safety advice, much of which has caused utter chaos in the sector. Then in July this year, he and Dame Judith Hackett and one or two other people produced a report for the government, which came to the radical conclusion, we do not need to worry about buildings under 18 meters. And as you can see, they assert in their report, there is a risk aversion developing in the market. Now, having looked at their report, I can't see any data that they've used particularly to reach their conclusions. And I remind you of that slide we looked at earlier, which says that in a building effectively below 18 meters, you have twice the chance of a fatality as you do in a building above 18 meters when there's a fire. So how this group can assert as experts, there is no systemic risk in buildings under 80 meters seems utterly illogical. So where are we? We're now at the point where, as the result of the continuing crisis, flat sales have collapsed. Flat sales are down by 50% by value and 60% by volume compared to where we were in 2018. We still do not have reliable data for planning what we do next. And some of the data that we did have that was very useful has been ignored for some reasons. And until we join all of the dots and until we use that data effectively, we are not going to find a solution to the building safety crisis. And it will run for at least another 3 to 4 years. So I think that's about the end of my presentation. So if we've got some questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Great, thank you for that quite sobering presentation, Martin. Yeah, just a reminder, if anyone has any questions, put them in the chat so we can avoid people speaking over each other. I did have one question just to get us started. I was wondering if you could just share a bit more detail about from who or what kind of data you would like to see more openly available to help address this crisis.
Well, there's a range of data that the Home Office has been very reliable in collecting some of the information. It has, but we do not have an organised system for holding building information. It is part of the building safety bill, so it will happen at some point in the future. But you know, we've had computerized building information management systems since the late 1980s, and I remember because I was involved in it. And for some reason, that that data keeps being lost. And it's been very consistent throughout the cladding crisis that when people need to find out what's happened at the building, what the building was actually made of, suddenly the developer discovers that they lost the computer file. So we perhaps just need a better backup system for the country.
Right. Thank you. I can see there's a question from Catherine. Would you like to read it out, Catherine, or would you like me to?
No, I can read that.
I can read. So yeah, for the recording, it says, Martin, where do you get your SAT sale data?
Oh, it's dead easy. It's not complicated at all. The land registry price paid data. The figures I quoted were some data that I extracted for the Telegraph. We've done it for the Times as well. The only thing you have to be slightly careful of is there are errors in the land registry data you need to filter out, and you need to wait about 3 to 4 months before you examine the data, because there's a backlog in recording information into their files.
Great, thank you. And there's also a comment from Matt. I wondered if you wanted to bring this up, or if you had a question related to this, Matt.
Hi, yeah, no, it wasn't so much a question, it was an observation really. I just thought it was really interesting to take Martin's point and say actually in the year post Grenfell, the 0.4% figure went to 0.1, and then the next category down in terms of height halved from 0.8 to 0.4. So I think that's sort of, whereas the 1 to 3 story number went up. So I think it sort of speaks to Martin's point that we need reliable factual risk assessment as opposed to arbitrary lines in the sand that were maybe written for political reasons in response to Grenfell.
Yeah, and I mean the other point on that, Matt, is when you're looking at percentages that are down at that level, you're going to have a lot of potential variance every year. And if government just sits there and goes, oh well, we're down at 0.1% this year, we don't need to worry anymore, that can be very dangerous. And I think that's where we got to pre-Grenfell. It's how BRE produced its data and said, you know, we think with 1 or 2 unfortunate exceptions, there is very little risk. And that's not how it works at all. Yeah, and I see that Catherine said, yeah, fatalities are small, maybe look at injuries. I mean, that brings out a fundamental divergence between what government is saying in terms of the fact it says everyone is overreacting because there's very few fatalities, and what the industry is saying, which is it's not fatalities is the concern, it's damage to property. The buildings insurers are concerned about the fact that if we are getting fires and it's costing money, that impacts the premium rates, and the same with the surveyors. So yeah, injuries, but if you go back to my figure about sprinkler systems and the reduction in damage to property that happens when you've got a sprinkler system, you know, it goes down by 90%, or 88% was the figure. It's that sort of data that's just as important as the fatalities data.
Absolutely. We've got about 15 minutes left. Are there any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I've got a question. We've got a very interesting visitor, because there's a gentleman from Australia watching. Hello, Ted. You're not going to say anything. So that's Ted Balliol is the ex-premier for Victoria. So he led the high-rise task force following various problems they had in their country.
Hello, Martin. I'm half awake.
Very good to hear you. Tell it. How are things going over there at the moment, Ted?
In the cladding arena, we have we are progressing in our state in accordance with the plan. We've got a list of buildings which are being remediated by an agency, a government agency that was established. They're working their way through it, and the existence of that is of that agency and that work and the pre-commitment of government funds has produced calm and confidence in the industry in our state. I think perhaps the state of New South Wales are a little bit further behind us.
Yeah. Okay. And how are you doing with your data? Because I know last time we talked, we were talking about what the government was doing to collect data, so you knew what buildings you've got and which ones were high risk and medium risk and low risk.
Well, the difference between the work that's been done was that, at least in our state, there was a proactive movement, and we went out and searched for the buildings using every available tool, including the knowledge of local inspectors, and that created a register of buildings which ought to have then been risk assessed by an expert panel. And that work has continued, but I think on a monthly basis, there are still buildings being found, is the word we used. So I don't think there's an immediate data source that we could go to and say, press a button and this is the number of buildings involved. It was done organically. It was done in an analog kind of way.
Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, at some point we'll try and get you back for a chat in Parliament again, because I think this issue is going to run for quite a while, isn't it?
I'll be happy to do that. I just forgive me, I'm not turning my video on because I'm basically sitting here in my jammies. So.
Who knows? Other people may be doing the same. Thanks.
Now, I will say it is interesting because the reason why I'm on this call is because I've been fascinated about where the UK data is, what the UK data is based on, and I see figures of the number of homeowners affected or people affected being in the several million, and then a figure of a few hundred buildings, and the inconsistencies I think have been a bit of a puzzle for me. So I was interested to hear what you said, Mark. Yeah.
It's very clear that we still have some big problems with data over here, and there seem to be some political interest in talking the numbers down sometimes, and then they want to talk them up other times. I think we still have to get to a consensus point on what we do with the numbers, and going forward, there is an acceptance that we've got to have a lot more effective data about individual buildings. It's just a question of how on earth they're going to define the standard of what that information is. And you talk to the various technocrats, and they tell you that they either do or don't agree that the ISO standard that we've got out there does or does not work. So there's still more to do. I saw someone has mentioned the Leeds project. Yeah, we looked at that a while ago. I was going to mention it, but there's so many sort of different options as to what we talked about today. I ended up leaving them out. But yeah, we are aware of that. Don't worry.
Just for context, if anyone is watching this recording back, I'm not sure if the comments are included. It's about some analysis done on the Home Office data by University of Leeds and Phil Murphy. I can see there's a question from Harry there in the chat as well. I can read it out if it says, what's happening with the government data on total amount of leasehold dwellings? Too low compared to Leasehold Knowledge Partnership's 6 million plus calculation.
Yeah. Yeah, the original number that the government produced on the size of the leasehold sector was based on some work that we did in 2013. They didn't actually have their own number at the time, and they assumed it was about 1 million. We produced a figure of 5.37 million, but that included socially rented properties. And eventually we agreed with the government to produce what they said was a number of just over 4 million. So in terms of the total number of homes that are impacted, i.e. flats, it's not the 6 million because the 6 million included houses, but we are probably looking at 5 million or so properties in the country. So it is a lot of housing stock. It is growing quite rapidly, and the fact that we don't really know what's going on. You remember last Christmas I gave a talk where we looked at the GLA figures and how they were absolutely ridiculous, and we got the audience to calculate their own better figure, which ended up being nearly 3 times as large as that of the GLA. So yeah, there's still work to do in that area.
See, there's another question. Have you talked to GeoPlace and how UPRN can help here? I'm not sure what UPRN stands for.
Unique property reference numbers, or whatever it is. Yeah, there are several data sources, and we've talked with the ODI as well about how we might try and integrate some of those data sources, because another one is the post office address file, the PAF as it's called, and that gives you a fairly good indication of whether you've got multiple properties within a single postcode with the same core address, i.e. a block of flats. But the trouble is there's nobody else really wants to do the work. So until we do, there is another, in terms of assessing which buildings are at risk, there is actually a wonderful data source, but nobody's sort of decided to go and talk to them or work out how to use it yet, and that's Google. Now, Google's not exactly ODI focused in that they're proprietary, but nonetheless, they do hold an exceptional amount of data, which would and could be used to help us work out how many properties are likely to have cladding. But again, the government, I mean, we suggested that to the government, I think 6-7 months ago, and I've not heard that they're doing anything.
We've got about 5 minutes left if anyone has any final questions.
You've got a question about will the slides be available? Yes. Are you going to put them out? Well, I mean, we'll put them on our website.
The whole talk will be available on the ODI's YouTube channel. That's probably the best place to catch up with it.
Yeah. There's one more question. The data appears to discourage removing thousands of low-rise buildings from scope. What are Michael Gove's options here?
Yeah, well, since that comes to Seb, that's what I was asking the question. Yeah, it's difficult. We don't know what the new Secretary of State is going to do. That bit of data that I showed earlier on about fatalities in mid-rise buildings. I mean, to me, that suggests you can't sit there and ignore those buildings and say there isn't a risk that we need to be looking at. But government will have to work out what it wants to do. In the same way, it has to work out what it does with higher risk buildings. So things like retirement and care homes. There's obviously a different policy that you need in sort of managing that sort of problem than you might in an ordinary residential block.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, there's one comment, very useful and somewhat shocking for you, from Grenfell. Certainly true. Sebastian, I don't know if you had any final comments that you wanted to say in these last couple of minutes.
No, not really, but thank everybody for coming, and special thanks to Ted Bailey for logging in his pajamas to this talk. And I don't think I can emphasize how welcome your comments have been from Australia in analysing how we in the UK have managed, or if that's not the right word, the building safety crisis hitherto. And I very much look forward to further contributions from you. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm not sure we got many Australian attendees to these lunchtime lectures. Might be the first. Oh, there is one last question from Richard. Is there a similar challenge with commercial property?
Yeah. I mean, we've seen various commercial buildings burned down, and I know that the fire experts in that part of the sector are very concerned that we don't have sprinklers. The rules apparently changed that you are less of an obligation to install sprinklers than you did before. And I think, what was it? We saw the Ocado warehouse burned down. I think that was a fire that went on for a couple of days. So yeah, there are problems in the commercial sector.
Well, I think that's a good point to stop. So to say thank you again, Martin and Sebastian, for taking part in the lunchtime lecture, and thank you everyone for joining and for all your questions. As Freya said, the recording will be available on YouTube, so you can refer back to it there. Okay. Thank you all.
Well,
Have a great rest of your Friday.
Cheers, thanks.